I did go ahead and get everything together, as you saw as we ended yesterday. I let everything dry overnight after I painted. Now, what did I do to paint? Well, I really like Krylon paint. I think it really works extremely well. It's flat, which I really want the models to be flat. Then I mounted the entire assembly on a piece of gator board. And the 1/2-inch gator board here, of course, has a foam core. And Krylon does not work very well against foam. It actually eats it. So then I came back on the foam, the gator foam, and I actually sprayed that with Model Masters flat black. And the Model Masters has the magic that it does not eat into foam. So if you can find some of this, it is a Pactor product. I've already laid out, as you can see, the letters for the sign, and I used the photograph that I had here to kind of space things out and get an idea. And I want to talk a second about type. When I worked as a production artist, one of the things they taught me, a little trick, is to take your eyes and squint. Just squint down. And you want to squint just enough so that you see the letters, but it kind of wipes everything else out in the background. And the reason for that is that then once I concentrate on those letters, I see the spacings, and do they look right? Now, it may not be 100% right now, but it's very close, and it's very close, I think, to the photograph that I'm using as an example. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the ends, and I'm going to work in. I'm going to go ahead and put the S and the L on. How am I going to put those on? Well, I've got dissimilar materials. I've got brass that's been painted, and I've got PVC Centra letters that my printer printed out in the same method that we use for the background buildings. I've cut all those out. Another trick I learned at production artwork at an advertising agency is to take a black magic marker and to cover the backside and the edges of something. If I want to get rid of white, which is what this was printed on, white PVC Centra, then all I need to do is just take a magic marker and stroke it on those edges. I do that a lot with wood. I do it with paper. I do it with anything where I don't want that edge to be seen or where I want it to go away. It's a theatrical thing, but the eyes of the human being, all of us, we kind of ignore black. It goes away. So what kind of glue am I going to use? Well, I'm going to go to 5-minute epoxy. Larry Deal, my buddy here in Kansas City, he buys this stuff in 55-gallon drums and uses it almost exclusively, I think, when he's actually an excellent modeler. He's won national contests, but he loves using epoxy as a glue. I'm going to use epoxy this time because I want it to bond to the back of that surface, and I want it to wrap around that wire that it's going up against, this carrier wire that I have here on my sign framework. So I think the epoxy will wrap around that and grab it very well. The epoxy will have probably a little more flexibility than I would if I used crazy glue. I could go with a medium viscosity crazy glue and do the same thing, but I don't like the brittleness of the crazy glue, especially when the sign can flex, even though it's on my base piece here. So I'm going to do the Larry Deal technique and go with the epoxy. Now, one thing I have available to me, and you could do it just as well, this is just a piece of cardstock, and there are pieces that I have left over once I cut the stencils that we sell, that John Lawrence and I sell, and I use it all the time for mixing my epoxies. And I don't try and get really accurate with this. I'm just going to put out a dot. This part B or whatever it is. It's a little bit. That's about right. There you go. If you can see or not, but there on the camera you can see I've got a couple of dollops that are pretty even. Now, one thing that I do is I take tongue depressors, popsicle sticks. This one's a fairly thick one. And what I do with that is I take my X-Acto, I slit it down the center, and then oftentimes after I have slit it, I go ahead and I square off the end, or somewhat square anyway, and I use that as my mixing stick. And I'm going to try and keep a piece of paper towel here around, and we'll rip that. I hate to waste paper towels, so I tear them into little pieces all the time. We'll use that to clean the stick with. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just mix this, and I'm not too fancy about how I do it. Let's turn this closer to my edge here. Just any way to get it mixed in. Keep cleaning my stick off so I make sure I don't get a bunch of one or A or a B on there that doesn't mix. Just takes a few seconds to mix it, but it is only good for about 5 minutes, so you want to work pretty quickly with this, or at least I try to. I'm going to get over here where the camera can see it. I'm going to put a whole bunch on this back because, again, I want it to wrap around that wire. And I wouldn't mind, actually, if in between some of these wires where I have my uprights, if it grabbed onto those as well. And again, as I said before, the only thing I'm going to do here, and I'm sorry for my head in the upper shot, we'll see if we can get the side camera here can get it, but I am going to squint that and make sure that I'm kind of straight up and down and looking good. That looks pretty good right there. I think I've got contact. So next we'll go to the L. Now I did look at the L and the S, my last and my first letter here, and I tried to make sure that I had somewhat the correct spacing for these letters. If you notice on the Master Art, the photograph, that I have some space here. You can see there's a brace that's showing here, and you can't hardly see it, but on that column over there, the S, it actually has some breathing space as well. So I'm going to set these in just a little bit, and actually I kind of goofed on that first one. We'll go back and we'll change it a little bit. It actually shows on my photograph, get as straight up and down as I possibly can. It actually shows that my letters are sticking above this top thing. So let's move that up a little bit. Pull that up just a little bit. Get them up there where they're above that wire. Okay. Now I think my spacing here is pretty good. So I think I got enough stuff here, enough glue, and it doesn't seem to be hard yet. So we'll put that on there, a little on here. I used to work with Malcolm Furlow sometimes too, and he always had the saying, whoops, he always had the saying, didn't get any on there, thank goodness. He always had the saying, put some, so I'm put some glue on here, and we'll give it a shot and see how it goes. You couldn't see it, but I was squinting a bit just to make sure that I get that thing kind of spaced out there with the U. It's pretty good. Up and down. Just a few words about type if you're interested, and we all should be, because the signs on our railroad really are some of the main things that we have to show off what's going on. Letters that are rounded, O's, S's, U's, anything that has a dip that goes below the baseline of a letter. When depositors make up type and make up letters, and it's done by your computer automatically for you, that loop will dip just a half a millimeter or sometimes a millimeter, depending on the size of the type, below that baseline. So you want to be very careful. Don't just take a baseline and put it there and put all your letters against it. You'll get done and your eye will say, it doesn't quite look right, and that's because that loop in the round letters has not dropped below. It wants to drop below a little below that baseline in order to look correct. So let's make up some more of the epoxy. There we go. I think that's looking pretty good. If we squint it, looks kind of good to me. So I think we're all right. We can cap this epoxy back up. I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and then we'll take it in and we'll set it in the layout, and we'll have the final proof. So hopefully it'll look really good on the building. So here I have the finished sign, and we're ready to put it up on place. This is where this mounting board's really going to come in handy, because I can place this up here on the building, and that's kind of centered on the aisle. But I've already looked at this once. I kind of cheated a little bit. I really don't like that, because in the photograph that we had of the Stuart Hall building, it actually lined up with my end column of bricks there. So we can move it over a little bit. It'll still be well centered in, or close to centered at least, in the aisleway, but it'll look a little bit more like the Stuart Hall building does downtown. Now, if you're really critical, you'll notice that when you go for barbecue to Jack Stack Barbecue, the Freight House downtown, which is fantastic Kansas City barbecue, you will notice that the sign is actually on the left-hand side of the building. But that's all right. Give me a little modeler's license for shoving it over to the side. But I think that really looks great. It is a national landmark, and I think you'll really enjoy the barbecue and doing the sign. So see you in Kansas City in 2018.